So let's talk a little bit about climate change. And I don't mean the kind that you usually think of, but you know how when you're in a room and there's conversation and all of a sudden someone says, "Hey, did it just get chilly in here?" You can actually change the climate in a room, in the environment in which you're communicating by things that you say or don't say. And this is otherwise known as confirming and disconfirming language. And what that means is confirming language is the extent to which a person sees themselves as being valued or being welcomed or being important somehow. And of course, then disconfirming language is when a person feels that they've been diminished, they've been dismissed, and that they're overall not valued. And one thing to keep in mind when we talk about confirming and disconfirming language is that language is not neutral. So frequently people will say, they're just words. Well, they're never just words because words inherently have meaning to people, and those meanings may be very different. One thing that I want you to keep in mind as I go through these slides is that the receiver is the one who decides whether the message is confirming or disconfirming. So even if a person says, well, I didn't mean to be rude, if the person picked it up that whatever they did was dismissive, then that's what it is. And so this is something that we'll keep revisiting throughout all of these slides. Moving on to the first slide, I decided to organize this just a little bit differently. So disconfirming language, again, it diminishes the presence of a person or diminishes or decreases the importance of the communication with that person. And I'm really going to break it down into a couple of categories just to make it clear. Instead of giving you 10 different disconfirming behaviors, let's break them down into 4 categories. So the first category is what I'm just going to call no response. For whatever reason, that just there's nothing there. The second category is going to be there is a response, but it's really unclear as to what the person's trying to say. The third and fourth category are similar in that they both provide responses, but neither of which are very good. And so kind of like the red pill, blue pill in the Matrix, it's like, both of these are kind of bad. And so some of them are on-topic responses and some of them are off-topic responses, but they're both responses, but they're still disconfirming. So let's go first to the no response category. So the first kind of disconfirming behavior is what's called silence. And again, this is just when a person says nothing. So I thought a picture of the Silence of the Lambs would be a nice way to remember that. Silence of the Lambs, great movie. And it's a little different from something else that we talked about in class, which is impervious behavior. So impervious behavior means the person has failed to acknowledge you. And that may be very different than a person who is just silent. So again, this might be in the ears of the beholder because that silence may be the perfect response. But if it isn't for the person that's saying something, then it would be considered disconfirming. So an impervious behavior would be one, for example, if you're standing in line at a Starbucks or where at a store, and the clerk doesn't acknowledge that you're there. Many times a clerk will say, or customer service representative will say, we'll be with you in a minute. Okay, that would not be impervious behavior. Impervious behavior would be you simply don't exist until you get up there. Another example of impervious behavior is sometimes when you're going through any kind of checkout line and the clerk or the person that's bagging your groceries or your items doesn't say hello, they don't ask you if you want paper or plastic, there's no acknowledgement that you're even actually there. That's very different from silence in terms of how that person is going to receive that. The third so there's failing to acknowledge the other, and then the third kind of no response would be is when people engage in other activities. And again, that may mean that they're also failing to acknowledge you, but just the simple act of engaging in another activity in and of itself can be disconfirming. So if you've got a special date night with your partner, and you're sitting in a restaurant and you excuse yourself for a minute. When you come back, they're on their phone. That is engaging in other activities that could be perceived as being disconfirming. In fact, I think most people would say that's disconfirming. So, if you're in the middle of doing something and then you look over and someone is writing something down, or they're, on their phone, let's go with on their phone because that's the great thing to blame. That would be considered then disconfirming in a non-responsive way, but it's because a person's actively doing something else. Moving to the second category, then we have what might be known as an unclear response. So I thought just a foggy, window might kind of make this a little bit clearer. And so there's a couple of examples under here. The first is what I'm going to call an ambiguous response. And that's one that's maybe the response is vague or it has more than one meaning. Like if a person said, that's nice. or when you ask someone, how are they doing? And they say, I'm fine. Okay, we all know fine is not fine. Fine is anything but fine. So that would be an example. Or, if someone said, how was your day? And the answer was, okay, you know, or comments like whatever might also be kind of ambiguous. It's like, do you really mean whatever, or are you saying whatever because you're angry? So it's when it's possible that you could interpret that message a different way, then it would be considered ambiguous. So I've got, again, the example of is this a rabbit or a duck? It's both. The second kind of unclear response is what is called an incongruous response. And try to find some kind of image that illustrates this, and let me know if you find it. This is when the verbal and the nonverbal behavior disagree. So a really good example would be, mom is cooking dinner and child comes in and says, hey mom, look at what I drew. And mom, without even turning around, says, that's nice, dear. Okay. So the words are saying one thing, the words are acknowledging and complimenting the child, but the nonverbal behavior, the not stopping for a minute, turning around, looking at the artwork, oohing and ahhing over it, putting on the refrigerator, those are in conflict with each other. And one thing to keep in mind as we move into nonverbal communication is if the verbal and the nonverbal messages conflict, we usually tend to trust the nonverbal because those are the ones that are really hard to hide. Verbal is really easy to disguise, but nonverbal behavior is much harder to disguise. So this would be considered an incongruous response, and this signage here I think is pretty incongruous. I stop? I can't go left, I can't go right, I can't turn around. What does this mean? So it simply means that there's no way we can actually discern what direction we should take. Therefore, it would be considered unclear. And now we move on to the next category, which is, the third and the fourth category, which is when you actually get a response from somebody, but, and this is the first but, it's on topic, but there's a problem with it. So one of the first big problems is that the person has interrupted or tries to complete a sentence. Really common occurrence with people, for example, who stutter, is that people think they're helping out by trying to complete the sentence. And that's like the most disconfirming behavior you can do for someone who's struggling to finish a sentence. And interrupting, of course, is very, very common. I know some of you put on your papers that would be something that you would like to try to change. We do have a tendency to interrupt people. We think we know where they're going with the end of their sentence before they get there. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about listening, because there's a reason why we do that. But both of those would be considered disconfirming behavior. Another one is what's called impersonal language, which is, as this slide illustrates here, this image, it is what it is. An impersonal response is one that's simply trite or superficial, that's sort of like a cliche that people say all the time. So, for example, if someone tells you if someone tells you bad news and your response is, well, it is what it is. I mean, that would be like the most impersonal and most dismissive comment ever that you could probably say. So it is what it is would be an example if someone said, well, good luck with that, or, well, that sucks for you, And again, this depends on the person that is hearing this statement. It might be that it is what it is exactly what they want to hear. Or for someone to say, hey, it sucks to be you, they think, yeah, you're right, it does suck to be me. So it really depends on the receiver. And if they perceive this as being a statement that is not helpful at all, and in fact diminishes the significance of their statement, then they're going to read it as being disconfirming. And then finally, what's also called condescending language, and an example of this would be, a couple of different examples, would be if a person kind of points out their own status, to try to make other people feel inferior, so the person who might say, for example, well, and that's why I'm your boss, that would be it's like, I'm trying to tell you something and that's your response to me, is that you're reminding me that you're my boss. Of course I know you're my boss. Or that's why I make more money than you, would be another example. A really good example also of condescending language is when people, point out like a word that you've mispronounced, that like you said the wrong word or you mispronounced a word, and all of a sudden that becomes like the butt of the joke. It's like, oh, you said that word, and you're like, yeah, it was an honest mistake. Who doesn't misspeak every once in a while? And then they bring it up over and over again, or they keep teasing you about it. I think teenagers tend to do this, being around a lot of, 18, 17-year-olds tend to do that a lot. And it's, called punching down, when someone makes an innocent mistake and then someone jumps on it, or a whole tribe of people, jump on it and, try to poke fun at you. Then that would be like the epitome of, condescending language. And as you know, very disconfirming. And then finally, the last group then is responses that go off topic. I will change the color on that when I put it in the slide into the canvas. That there is a response, but it has really nothing to do with what it was you were saying. So unlike category 3, category 4 isn't really about you at all. So the first kind of response, or the first kind of language, is what's called an irrelevant response. And this is when whatever's said is unrelated to what the person is saying. So the person's talking about oranges, you say something about apples, you're in line to order something, and you're talking to somebody about something, and then they're maybe looking at the to-go menu and they say, well, do you want to order this or this? And you're like, well, I don't know. I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about something else, and I was talking about something else. So many times it's just an innocent mistake, and so many times for the receiver, it's not considered disconfirming, but it can be considered disconfirming depending on the context in which it happens. The second kind of response that then goes off topic is what's called a tangential response, and this is one where you certainly acknowledge what a person said, but then you completely steer the conversation into a new direction. So it might be that they said something and then you bounce off of that and say, what you noticed in, something else has nothing to do with them. So really all of this is disconfirming because it doesn't back up that you heard what the person said and you simply have moved on into another direction. So I think that kind of the detour sign is a good example of that. And then finally, what's called stage hogging, which I thought that's probably one of the easiest ones. So stage hogging is a tangential response that keeps going and going and going. So stage hogging is when and we all have friends that do this, where, you tell a story and then a friend says, oh, that reminds me of something that happened to me. And then it's all about them and they never bring it back to you to say, is this sort of how you felt too? There isn't any kind of confirmation that what you said was meaningful or had any impact. It simply was a launching point for them to continue with their own story. So that's stage hogging, which again is a tangential response that keeps going and going and going. That would be the best way I would delineate those. And then we move into disagreeing language. So disagreeing language is not disconfirming because it acknowledges a person is there, but it also implies that the person is somehow wrong. And so this is sort of in the middle between confirming and disconfirming language, which is what's called disagreeing language, which can also make people upset as well. So again, it usually just tells person that they're wrong in one way or another. So one way is to simply be argumentative and say, oh, that's not true, or I disagree with you, without it saying, hey, I heard what you said, I understand what you're saying, but I disagree. That would be not the same. An argumentative statement would be, you're wrong, and this is why, without acknowledging that the person said something in the first place. And also another kind of disagreeing language is what's called complaining away, and that's when someone says loudly, perhaps when you're not too terribly far away. Parents tend to do this sometimes. Gee, I just thought I did all those dishes this morning, and look, now they're all in the sink again. And so it's also very indirect language, but the idea is to say somebody screwed up here and it wasn't me, somebody else screwed up, or, well, how did all these books get over here? And again, it depends on the receiver who's hearing that as to whether or not that's disagreeing language or if that's just, a clue from somebody that, you forgot to move your stuff. So it always goes back to the receiver on that one. The third kind of disagreeing language is what's called aggression, and aggression includes both threats and name calling. So it can be, calling somebody names would be disagreeing language because you are recognizing that they are there. You're just not being very kind. And it's the same with threats. If you say, if you do that again, I'm gonna get really super mad, or if you don't do that, then this is going to happen. That would also be considered disagreeing language and not disconfirming language. Interrupting, again, this might be one of those that is either disagreeing or disconfirming, depending on, again, the receiver and the context of the situation and the nature of the conversation. So interrupting would be one that can be put into both categories, both disagreeing and also disconfirming. And then finally, passive-aggressive statements, which we all know those when we hear them. We'll talk about those more in a bit more detail when I talk about conflict, but the passive-aggressive statement is a statement that's meant to wound somehow, or, land, it's a hitting below the belt, so to speak, where it's like, oh, you actually meant for me to hear that. Okay, that wasn't very nice. And again, it might be that it's passive aggressive for the receiver, but maybe the sender didn't mean it to be passive aggressive. But the person said, well, why did you say that? That wasn't very nice. And they're like, oh, I didn't mean it to not be nice. I was just saying it to, as sort of like a, well, now here's where we're at kind of thing. All right, last slide, and this lecture is getting much longer. I'll go very quickly through these. These are all the confirming types of language, which we will talk about when we get into listening, is where we can actually see these happen. First is just recognizing somebody. Again, customer service, perfect example. If you recognize somebody and say, hey, I'll be with you in a minute, or thank you for waiting, or sorry for the wait, then someone feels like they haven't been invisible for, minutes. Also acknowledging the feelings and the value of the other person, or the value of the relationship. So saying, I'm sorry you're upset, or this happens all the time. If you call AAA, for example, they say, well, I'm really sorry that happened. Are you safe? So they will acknowledge your feelings, and they acknowledge the fact that you've called. And you can also do that by, valuing the relationship. Say, really, your friendship with me is really important. And just saying that sometimes is just does a world of difference. Also agreeing or confirming someone's evaluation of a situation. If someone has an idea as to what's going on and you say, you know what, I think you're onto something here. That's really confirming to know that what you've thought of, putting problems together and kind of coming up with a solution, that someone is acknowledging that and says, yeah, I agree. I think that might be a good situation, or you might have that analysis correct. And it could also be, you say, I really appreciate the fact that you are thinking this way, because I think you're on the right track here, and I'm not sure if this is entirely what's going on. I mean, you can still disagree, but you at least acknowledge the person and what they've contributed there. Complimenting both verbal and nonverbal. And this is sometimes nothing else is going on in the conversation, but, it's that moment where, someone in a store says, hey, I really like your t-shirt. That's really cool. Or, you see, someone, I was complimented when I was getting my COVID vaccination, and the technician that gave me my vaccination said, I really like your shoes. It's like, what a nice thing to say. I mean, you're sticking a needle in my arm, but at least you have seen me as a complete person who's wearing shoes, and thank you very much for the compliment. So it's amazing what a compliment will do, verbal, or even the acknowledgement, like when you're driving down the street in your neighborhood and you wave at somebody, it's like, I see you and I'm smiling at you, and we're all in this neighborhood together. So, that's also considered very confirming. Supporting or reassuring someone. And it's not just soothsaying and saying, well, everything's going to be okay. But it might be that you can say everything is okay, or things will be better. And it's not necessarily one of those impersonal, trite comments, but something that the person actually needs to hear. And this is what you figure out through, good listening and also understanding the person that you're talking to. The next would be questioning, just finding out, instead of just saying, oh, really, that's too bad, of saying, well, what happened? What did, how did that happen? And how did you feel about it? And, what did the other person say? Questions like that make a person feel like they're really being listened to. I think this might be the last one. Paraphrasing and summarizing what people say. Again, we've talked about paraphrasing a little bit with perception checking, of kind of saying, this is what I heard. Is this really what you meant? We'll talk about this in greater detail when we talk about listening, because this is really key to being a good listener, is being able to paraphrase what people say, or summarizing, saying, so what I'm hearing you say is this, and you go back and you completely wrap it up. That was the last one. Okay, and then I'm just tacking the slide on because we talked about it in class. This was the quick quiz as to which statements about women's speech are true, and I've highlighted the 3 that are true. And again, you did this as a poll. So, and again, women's speech is more polite. It's more permission seeking. It's more euphemistic. I'll talk about that in greater detail at some point, or you can ask me a question. All right, that's it for this lecture, this kind of revised lecture to make things, I think, a little bit clearer. And from here, we're going to be moving into the next section.